Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, August 18th. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing, making beer at home. Well, as you probably know, there are four main ingredients to beer: water, hops, yeast, and malt, or malt extract. Well, today, we take a long look at malt and the malting process. What does it take to get grain, like barley or wheat, ready to use in brewing? And what are specialty malts, and how are they different from base malts, and what are they? Well, to let us in on the details of the malting process, we've asked an expert to join us, Bob Hansen, Technical Services Manager of Briess Malt and Ingredients Company. We get into quite a bit of detail with Bob because we at Basic Brewing Radio believe that knowing what our ingredients are and how they are made will help us to become better brewers. If we know more about the process that creates a specialty malt, for example, we'll have a better idea of the flavors that malt will give our beer. We started our interview with Bob Hansen with the most basic question we could think of. What is malt?
Malt is simply a product of the malting process in its simplest form, and many people have different terms for what they think is malt, but technically that's what malt is. Malting is a process that takes a seed and produces a malted seed. Now, most people think of malt in terms of malted barley, which is the most popular malted grain in the world by far. But most craft brewers also know that many types of seeds can be malted and are familiar with wheat malt and rye malt. And maybe a few of them have worked with other exotic malted grains, such as spelt or triticale. But basically, malt is a seed that has gone through the malting process and is normally commonly referred to for barley.
And in malting, you're kind of tricking the seed into thinking that it's going to sprout and turn into a plant, right?
Well, yes and no. You're not really tricking the seed. It actually is. The first step of the process is germination, and the seed begins to sprout and starts to grow, a root and a shoot, just like it were in the ground. It's kind of old world hydroponics, if you want to think about it that way.
And what happens? So you get the barley or the grain that you're malting wet, right? And start that germination process. What happens inside that grain during this germination process?
Well, initially, as you mentioned, you get the seed in, and it may be it always is, to be stable in the field, it's dried down to a certain moisture content, where it is, a stable seed that won't grow in the farmer's silo. So when we get it, it's a stable, dry seed, just like you would use for planting almost, and it's typically about 8 to 12% moisture. Then that seed is first soaked in water, and that so the first thing that happens is the seed absorbs a lot of water. It gets up to about a 40% moisture content, and when it gets to that content, the seed, its growth is triggered, and it begins to grow. The barrier between the embryo and the endosperm is broken open, and the seed rapidly begins to, respire and grow, with the embryo absorbing nutrients from the endosperm and the rest of the seed, and using those as nutrients to fuel its growth. So when the barley gets, or seed to be malted, gets to about 40% moisture, this is done in big steeping tanks. It begins to grow, and it uses oxygen and produces CO2 and produces heat. So then the maltster will run water through the malt as it sits in its steep tanks to keep it cool and also to provide additional oxygen so that the growth cycle does not go anaerobic. So it's continually then fed cool water to keep it cold and oxygen to allow it to grow until its growth really speeds up. And that's after about 2 days in steep tanks, typically. After which point, it's dropped down into large beds called germination beds. And there it continues to grow. Now it's not necessarily hydroponically, it's just sitting in a bed maybe 2 feet deep that's constantly kept turning, that cool air is passed through to allow the seed to continue to grow. Additionally, the air is humidified so that the air passing through the seeds do not dry them out as they grow, and occasionally water may be sprinkled over the top of the bed to keep the malt at the ideal temperature and moisture content for growth.
And why go through this process? I mean, why chemically can't you just use barley from the field? Why do you have to go through the germination process?
Well, you could actually use barley from the field. The barley itself has a good amount of some of the enzymes that are needed to convert. However, because there are not enough of them, it would take a very long time. So, for example, if you were to try to brew a beer straight from barley, instead of taking 15 minutes to convert, as malt does, it might take as long as 36 hours. And during that time, at mashing temperatures, the mash would go sour. At 144 degrees, the malt are actually full of bacteria and funguses, so they would sour the mash intentionally. I'm sure you've probably heard of some brewers that actually use that to their advantage. But that would happen all the time.
And that's a heck of a long brew day, 36 hours.
Yeah, it really makes for a long brew day. That's why people choose malt, because it makes things easier for them. Additionally, during the malting process, some of the cell wall components, which are rich in beta-glucans, are broken down. The barley itself has the highest beta-glucan content of most seeds, and by breaking it down through the malting process, it doesn't provide problems with the separation process in the lauter tun later on, where raw barley, if it's used, tends to really gum things up due to those beta-glucans.
And we don't want the stuck sparge or the stuck lautering, for sure.
Stuck lautering, right. Additionally, if you use barley instead of malt, you don't have the same amount of soluble nitrogen and free amino nitrogen. The proteins are also, they begin to break down during the malting process, so that the wort that's created from malt has a higher FAN content than what you would get from barley, and thus there's plenty of available nutrients for your yeast.
Do you know a bit of the history of how this evolved? I mean, how did people come up with this malting process?
Well, there's various stories that I've heard. I'm not really sure how it got fully commercialized to the point where it is today. It was obviously done through baby steps. There's theories about grain being stored and rained on and naturally sprouting, and then people cooking that and it becoming sweet and them enjoying it and it spoiling to become beer. There's also theories about people who have taken bread and left it in the rain, and that's become the first beer. But early on in the process, people realized that just by trial and error that sprouting or malting, in essence, really allowed the process to occur much quicker.
So pick us up on a process. Where are we? We've gone through the germination, and we're getting into where the grain is in beds, and it's being encouraged to sprout further. So pick us up and take us on with the process. Okay.
Well, 2 days into the malting process, we're through steeping and we're into germination. That's where the grain has chitted. That is, it has started to actually show a sprout, and it's starting to grow. Now, germination typically lasts between 4 and 5 days for most malted grains. During that time, both a root and a shoot will begin to grow out of the malted seed. Mostly the roots grow, though. They can grow over a 4-day process to be almost 1.5 inches to 2 inches long.
Wow! So that's a substantial root.
Yep, and you get a little bit of a shoot coming out the front side too. At this time, then, the starch is broken down, the protein's broken down, all the beta-glucan has been removed, and the seed is rapidly making enzymes to degrade the starch for its future growth. This is a real boon for the brewer, of course. Now, and this is the point where he would like to maybe use that product, or it's got enough enzymatic power, and the beta-glucans are sufficiently degraded that it would be ready to be used to brew beer.
So the plant was making these enzymes for its own use of breaking down starches into sugars for it to make the plant, essentially, right?
That's right. It's almost like you're making it work for you. However, the seed itself, when it's wet, it doesn't store very well. If we tried to ship it to brewers, it would continue to grow, and it would actually begin to go rotten and sour if it isn't kept cool and constantly turning. So we need a way to stabilize that seed so that we can store it in silos and ship it. And so that's where the next stage comes in, which is the kilning process. And this is really just a process of drying the seed out. The seeds are, again, they're transferred out of the germination beds and they're transferred into another long, shallow vessel where they form beds, which, again, almost like a lauter tun, are very porous, so that hot air is blown through the seeds, the sprouted seeds. And additionally, they are also turned as they are in the germination beds to keep even temperatures and even moisture content throughout the process. Now, over about a course of 24 hours, possibly, the grain is dried from a 40% moisture content down to about 5% moisture content, at which point it becomes a shelf-stable malted product. Now, during this time, it also picks up a really agreeable flavor. If you've ever eaten sprouts, at your local store, they taste kind of, green, grassy. They don't taste like malt. Mm-hmm. And it's the drying process and how that's controlled that changes that flavor from what it would be in a raw or growing seed to the pleasant flavor of malt. And it's actually quite a challenge to dry it out. It must be dried out very carefully. The enzymes are actually very temperature sensitive, and they can be wiped out by too high of a heating temperature. So that initially during the drying process, they're dried with very low temperature relative air, maybe 120 degrees Fahrenheit, until the moisture content gets down. Once the moisture content gets down to about 12 to 15%, there's not as much water available, and the enzymes are stabilized by that lack of water. Then the heat is turned up, to upwards of 200 degrees to finish the drying process. But because of the lower moisture content, the enzymes are stable. It's at these higher temperatures that malt really develops its characteristic flavor.
And then at this point, if it's a base malt, I guess if you're an all grain brewer, you can start making beer, right?
Hot off the kiln, if you'd like.
Now let's talk a bit about the difference between base malts and specialty malts or specialty grains. If you look at a bin of black patent malt or something like that, it's quite a bit darker, and there's a whole selection of varieties of specialty grains to choose from. Is that the same barley that serves as a base malt?
In most cases, it actually is, and you'll see many suppliers, including our company, even offer varieties within the specialty malt, so that we offer both 2-row and 6-row versions of the same types of specialty malts. So we have a 2-row caramel and a 6-row caramel. We have a 2-row chocolate malt and a 6-row chocolate. And in most cases, it is a product that's come through the germination process and possibly also through kilning. But as you mentioned, there's a huge spectrum of colors and flavors. To create such a wide spectrum, the maltster or specialty maltster uses a variety of different all-natural, basically heating steps to create those flavors. I'll explain a little bit further in a moment. First off, though, I just want to distinguish between base malts and specialty malts. Normally, when we talk about base malts, there would be things like a 2-row and a 6-row, just regular brewer's malt. Additionally, other grains that are malted that are not made specifically to have unique colors and flavors, those are also really considered base malts. It's just that they're from a different seed. So wheat malt is considered a base malt. So is rye, and I mentioned some of the other exotics that are out there, such as spelt and triticale. They're unless they're specifically, say, caramel malt or chocolate spelt or whatever, they are considered base malts.
And what's the function of a base malt? How do they work differently within the malt or the mash or within the beer?
Well, typically your base malt is going to be the malt that you use, as a base for your recipe in the highest percentage, and its real role is to provide some background flavor as well as the main amount of sugar that will later be used for the fermentation. So a base malt, by necessity, has to have a large amount of starch and also a large amount of enzymes, so that it can convert any of its starch along with the starch of any specialty grain or adjuncts that are used additionally later on in the brewing process.
It's the muscle of the mash.
It is the muscle of the mash, and it's also the main sugar source.
So then the specialty grains or the specialty malts are there to enhance flavor and color mostly then?
That's exactly it. Making beer is like making soup, and the specialty malts are what help you allow to make different stocks for your soup. Your base malt gives you a base to work with, and then you blend in, just like you'd use a chicken, a pork, or a beef stock, you use, maybe Munich malts, caramel malts, and chocolate malts to make whatever variety of colors and flavors that you want in the finished product. How those are created is as I mentioned, is a quite varied and interesting process.
Pick out a couple of interesting examples.
Maltsters use what you would call three main types of processes to make the special flavors. First is just controlling that kilning temperature and the time and the moisture content during the drying out process of the seed. So there are a whole variety of malts that are simply made through the all-natural process of additionally heating them a little bit more or at different times during the drying out process. And those are typically called high-temp or kilned malts. Those would be malts like the German Munich-style malts, things like Vienna malts, and even pale ale malts and things, ale malt in general. They're kilned at a higher temperature, and they tend to have slightly darker colors, as well as bready, malty, or even biscuity type flavors to them. That higher temperature kilning, though, one of the consequences of that, other than color and flavor, is it also degrades some of the enzyme content, so that kilned malts typically have a lower enzymatic content than a base malt.
So you'd have a difficulty in just making a beer just from those malts.
Yes. In some cases, there is enough muscle, if you were, left in those malts, especially some of the lower colored ones, because the color is basically an indicator of how aggressively heated they were, to use as a large portion of the mash, but you may struggle. For things like Vienna malts or pale ale malts that are maybe in a 4 Lovibond color range, they have a pretty good enzymatic content, maybe like a diastatic power of about 80 versus a base malt being about 120 to 160. However, some of the higher colored or more flavored ones, such as the Munich malts, they may have diastatic powers only in about the 40 range. So then you're talking about 1/4 as much muscle as a normal base malt. Or in the case of some of the higher or darker colored Munich malts, you may be looking at maybe only a 5 or a 10 DP, in which case they do not have enough muscle to self-convert. So it's important for the brewer using these high-temperature kiln malts, and really any time they're going to use a large amount of specialty malts or a large amount of adjuncts, to make sure that there is enough muscle in their beer.
You talked about heating as a way to produce these specialty grains. What are the other methods?
Well, the next method, next to the class of kiln malts, are malts that are roasted. And the classic example of that would be a caramel malt. Caramel malts are very, very interesting. They're taken actually straight out of the germination bed and put into a big drum roaster, similar to what would be used to roast coffee or cocoa beans.
Hmm.
And then, in the case of caramel malts, they're still at 40% moisture. These seeds are slowly roasted over heat, and the dampers are closed to basically keep all the moisture in so that they don't dry out while they're being heated. As the kernel temperature inside the little seeds gets up to the gelatinization temperature of the starch, in the case of barley that's about 135 to 140, the starch gelatinizes, and then the active enzymes in there start to break the starch down, just like a little mini brew kettle. Okay? However, it's at such a low moisture content, 40% moisture, that's like 60 bricks, or 60 Play-Doh if you're a brewer, that the liquid can't escape from the seed. So the starch gelatinizes, liquefies, and converts, just like it does in a mash vessel. But it's held within the outer seed of the barley.
So you've got a really sweet product then.
Right. It actually is very sweet. It's a converted malt, almost like a little mash, in a seed coat. Then the dampers are opened up and the heat's turned up. And now the seed is allowed to dry out, and the sugars that are in there begin to caramelize because the temperature is raised very high. So you end up creating sugar within a seed and then caramelizing it. And that's how caramel malts are made. That's why when you cut them in half, you'll see that the interior of them is very glassy. That's an indicator of a true caramel malt.
And that's the sugars that we see inside.
That's right. The sugars, the starch has been converted into sugar and then actually caramelized right inside the seed. Additionally, then, the darker malts are produced on roasters. Again, using a slightly different, by varying the temperature, time, and moisture content, they are roasted to a very dark color and very intense flavor in most cases. Again, these roasters are very similar to coffee roasters or cocoa roasters. So by controlling the moisture, just as you do in those roasted products, you can create similar flavors. Roasted barley oftentimes can be used as a coffee extender. And, of course, chocolate malt tastes very much like cocoa.
Mm-hmm.
And these are roasted at very high temperatures that are very close to the combustion temperature of the grain, somewhere in the neighborhood of 400 to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. So inside these roasters, there are also ways of adding water so that basically the grains don't start on fire. And that's the reason why sometimes you'll see that in the dark roasted malts, the finished moisture content may actually be higher than what you would see in a caramel malt. For example, roasted barley and black malt, even chocolate, are typically about 5.5 to 6% moisture. They've obviously been roasted a lot more than an 80-degree caramel malt, which might be 4%. That extra moisture is moisture that was added near the end to keep them from bursting into flames.
It sounds like there's a lot of finesse in producing these specialty malts.
There is. It's just as much an art as brewing is, in that you're working with a natural product whose properties vary from batch to batch, and you're trying to make a consistent end product. And there's not a lot of inline automation that can necessarily tell you what to do. So it goes very much on feel and on look.
Does that round up the discussion on specialty malts?
There is actually a couple other what are called special processed malts that go through additional processing. Again, you look at the spectrum of different varieties of specialty malts out there. There are well over 50 standard different varieties, beyond just caramels and chocolates and high-temperature kiln malts. You've also got some malts which go through other sorts of processing. For example, you've got roasted barley and black barley, and those are actually seeds that are brought in that aren't run through the malting process. However, they are just dry roasted. Then you've got malts, they may be called special roasts or extra specials, or malts that are called things like biscuit malts. And these malts are actually double processed or specialty processed, so that they may be first be germinated and then kilned, and then we take a finished kilned malt and dry roast it in the roaster.
So it sounds like there's a lot more to the malting process and the specialty malting process than probably 90% of the brewers out there know. So maybe in the past half hour we've given at least a peek into the process enough to give people a better appreciation of, the next time they go to their homebrew shop and scoop out, a few pounds of grain, that they'll think a little bit about guys like you, Bob Hansen, back at Briess Malt and Ingredients Company, who are keeping their eye on the process.
It's really neat to be a brewer working at the malting company and to be able to see the complete process from seed to glass and understand that it's an art all the way through. And it's nice to be able to share that information.
We appreciate Bob Hansen of Briess Malt and Ingredients Company for taking time to talk with us. Next week, we continue our talk with Bob as he tells us how malt extract is made. And he gives us some tips on how to buy the best quality malt extracts and how to preserve their quality over time. I want to say a special howdy to Russ from Boston and Casey from Siloam Springs, right here in northwest Arkansas. Russ and Casey both wrote very uplifting notes, and I always appreciate good email. And I'd appreciate bad email, too, if it helped us out in improving the show. And also howdy to Jim in Springfield, Virginia, who is just getting started in homebrewing. Good luck, Jim, and be sure to let us know how you're going and let us know if you have any questions along the way. Now, don't forget, if you want to drop us a line, we'd be happy to hear from you. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say hey, write to james@basicbrewing.com or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And while you're there, you can check out our DVD, Basic Brewing, Introduction to Extract Home Brewing. You can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVD, and if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order it online. Well, that's all until next week. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dodson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time. So long.